March 1945. For the German soldiers dug in along the east bank of the Rhine, the river felt like a last line drawn on the map. Behind them was a long trail of defeat, shattered units, burned-out towns, bridges blown in panic. Rumor had turned into certainty. If the Allies ever got across the Rhine in force, there would be nothing solid left between them and Berlin. But the Rhine itself still promised something. It was wide, fast, and cold. In German staff thinking, it had always been a natural fortress. Blow the bridges, guard the obvious crossing points, smash any boats or pontoons with artillery and machine guns. A big river, the logic went, would slow tanks and trucks the way concrete walls slowed infantry. Most of the men on that bank knew about American Shermans, artillery, fighter bombers. They'd seen them, heard them, cursed them. What they hadn't seen were American trucks that could simply drive into the river and keep going. On the western bank, under camouflage nets and spring rain, a very different picture was taking shape. American engineers and logisticians had spent weeks quietly building up for the jump. Stockpiles of bridging gear and storm boats, rafts and assault craft, and long rows of strange, high-sided vehicles with blunt bows and winches on their noses. To a casual eye, the DUKW looked almost comical, like a regular 6x6 truck that had been given a boat haul and told to swim. No turret, no armor, no glamour. Just 6 wheels, a propeller, and a job to do. That job was simple and terrifyingly effective. Load troops or supplies miles from the river. Drive along normal roads like any other truck. Roll straight down a bank into the river and come out on the far side without waiting for a bridge. It wasn't designed to win firefights. It was designed to make the river itself irrelevant. In Allied command posts, maps of the Rhine were covered in pencil lines and colored arrows. Commanders argued about where to cross. Engineers calculated how many boats, how many pontoons, how many DUKWs they needed in each wave. German planners pictured the same scene very differently. In their minds, a crossing meant fragile assault boats nudging across under fire. Engineers desperately trying to throw pontoon bridges together while shells crashed around them. Tanks stacked up on the west bank, stuck until a crossing was finished. The idea that the enemy could arrive at the water's edge in a truck, roll straight in, and come growling out of the current on the far shore was, for most of them, somewhere between unlikely and unimaginable. As the chosen night in late March approached, the contrast sharpened. On the east bank, thin German formations clung to villages and vineyards, low on fuel, ammunition, and heavy weapons, but still comforted by the sense that at least the river is on our side. On the west bank, DUKW companies sat in assembly areas, their hulls chalked with nicknames and cartoons, loaded with infantry, anti-tank guns, radios, crates of ammunition. Engines idled. Drivers waited for the signal. Somewhere down by the water, a German machine gunner peered into the darkness, expecting to see shapes of boats and rafts. Instead, he was about to see something much stranger. Long, low silhouettes with wheels, rolling down the bank and gliding into the river as if the Rhine was just another road. For him, and for many of the men along that line, it would be the first time they understood the real problem. They hadn't misjudged the enemy's courage. They had misjudged his vehicles. The Rhine was supposed to be a wall. The ducks were about to turn it into a puddle. On one side of the Rhine, men were digging foxholes. On the other side, men were doing math. In Allied headquarters, the crossing wasn't being planned as a single dramatic moment. It was being treated like a giant transport problem. How many men need to cross in the first hour? How many anti-tank guns? How much ammunition, fuel, barbed wire, radios? How fast can all of that be moved from dump to shoreline to far bank? Every answer pointed to the same conclusion.
bridges and assault boats alone wouldn't be enough. Bridges are powerful, but they're also obvious targets, vulnerable to shell fire, bottlenecks that can handle only so many vehicles per hour. Assault boats are fast for infantry, but they can't carry trucks or guns. They have to be manhandled in and out of the water. The DUKW solved a different part of the puzzle. It plugged the logistical hole between first wave of infantry and we actually have a functioning army on the far bank. In planning sessions, engineers sketched out flows like a factory diagram. Rear area, DUKWs loading troops, ammo, jerry cans, crates. Road approach, ducks driving like normal trucks, using existing roads hidden by darkness and smoke. Riverbank, no need for elaborate docks, just a ramp, a cut in the bank, or even a gentle slope. River crossing, DUKWs switch from wheels to propeller, keeping loose formations, following marked routes across the current. Far bank, straight out of the water and onto inland tracks, unloading under cover, turning around for another run. Instead of everything fighting to use one or two bridges, the river itself became a highway with dozens of lanes invisible to German artillery maps. Commanders could now think in waves. Wave 1, assault infantry and storm boats and some DUKWs. Wave 2, more infantry and anti-tank guns in ducks. Wave 3, ammunition, radios, engineers, medical supplies. Wave 4 and onwards, a constant shuttle of supplies and reinforcements. The ducks were not the stars of the show. They were the conveyor belt in a factory, the thing that makes everything else possible. American DUKW companies trained for this like a choreographed routine. Crews practiced driving down steep, muddy banks without bogging, entering the water at just the right angle so they didn't ship a wave over the bow, keeping spacing in the darkness, following dim guide lights or the shadow of the vehicle ahead, landing on a rough, shell-churned bank and still finding enough traction to climb out. This training wasn't glamorous. It was repetition. Back up, load again, cross again, fix what broke. By the time the Rhine operation was on the calendar, the men in those units knew exactly how long a round trip took, how much fuel they'd burn, and how many crossings they could squeeze into a single night. Their officers weren't thinking in terms of, can we do it, but how many tons per hour can we push through? On the German side, intelligence officers did have reports about Allied amphibious gear. They knew about the landing craft from Normandy in Italy, strange tracked boats like the Buffalo and other LVTs, the fact that the Allies had gotten very good at crossing rivers and landing on beaches. But there's a difference between reading about something and feeling what it means. To many German staff officers, amphibious vehicles sounded like special equipment for special operations, limited, scarce, brought out only for big, obvious assaults like D-Day. They did not fully visualize thousands of mundane, ugly, effective ducks turning every stretch of riverbank into potential crossing ground. In their assumptions, the Allies would be tied to major roads leading to obvious bridge sites, prepared ferry points with proper ramps, large concentrations of boats that could be bombarded. The DUKW chipped away at every one of those assumptions. If you can put a crossing point on almost any stretch of bank, shift it a kilometer up or down overnight, and keep feeding the far side even if a bridge gets hit, then the strong river line on your situation map stops being strong. It becomes a thin blue stripe the enemy passes through instead of stops at. For the average German officer on the Rhine line, the DUKW never appeared in his orders as a specific threat. His briefing might mention enemy amphibious capability in a vague way, possible use of storm boats and motorized craft. No one told him they have trucks that swim and they will use them like taxis and delivery vans all night long. So when the shelling started and the searchlights went on and dark shapes began sliding into the water, he fell back on the mental picture he knew: boats, bridges, ferries. What he was actually watching was something else. A carefully rehearsed logistics system built around a machine his side had never imagined building. A simple, reliable, amphibious truck that turned Allied planning into reality and German assumptions into wishful thinking. The real secret wasn't the duck itself. It was the fact that an entire army had been organized so that thousands of them could be fueled, loaded, directed, and kept moving like clockwork. The Germans had planned to stop a dramatic coup de main at the river. What they were about to face instead was mass production on water. The order came in the form every soldier knew: less talk, more noise. First, the artillery. On the western bank, Allied guns of every caliber opened up at once. The night turned into a rolling sheet of sound. The far bank vanished in smoke and dust. For the German infantry in their foxholes, it was the familiar, sickening beginning of something big. They hugged the ground and waited. In their minds, the next step was also familiar. Assault boats, low in the water, paddling and chugging across. Maybe a few tracked landing vehicles. Engineers trying to lash pontoon bridges together under fire. So when the artillery shifted and the first shapes appeared at the water's edge, many defenders thought they were seeing landing craft. From a distance, in flashes of artillery light and the flicker of burning buildings, a fully loaded DUKW doesn't look like a truck. It looks like a long, low boat with a strange, boxy hull. On the west bank, the ducks lined up nose to tail, engines idling, bow waves already lapping at their fronts. Inside, infantrymen sat low, rifles across their knees. The hull sides came up high enough that many couldn't see much beyond a strip of sky. They felt the vehicle roll forward, the crunch of gravel under the wheels, and then the sudden shift as the front end dipped into the river. There was always a moment of doubt the first time you did it. Are we really going to float? Then the familiar lift, the strange change in the engine's vibration as the propeller took over and the wheels went light. The hull settled, water slapped against the sides, and the duck became what it had been built to be: a truck that had decided to stop caring where the land ended. The driver watched his guide lights, kept his angle against the current, and trusted the vehicle. The men in the back listened to the hiss of water, the thump of distant shells, and the occasional sharp crack of bullets hitting the hull or snapping overhead. On the east bank, a German machine gunner finally spotted movement through the smoke. Dark shapes were slipping into the water, not at a single point, but along a wide stretch of bank. They didn't bunch up like boats being launched from a narrow cove. They came in loose lines, like vehicles on a road. He opened fire. Tracers arced out, some sparking off metal, others vanishing into the darkness. For every hit, more shapes kept coming, sliding out into midstream. Where were the flimsy canvas boats he'd trained to shoot at? Where were the obvious crossing points he'd marked on his map? Instead, he saw vehicles going in where there were no obvious ramps, others entering the water hundreds of meters away, shapes that seemed to move from road to river without a pause. His officers tried to redirect fire, call for artillery, adjust to what they were seeing. But the river line that had looked so neat on the map was now crowded with targets they'd never rehearsed against. You can plan for a few ferry points. You can't easily plan for an enemy who can turn almost any piece of bank into a makeshift harbor. On the water, the ducks kept moving in their slow, determined way. They were not fast. They were not elegant, but they were steady. Each one carried a platoon of infantry, or an anti-tank gun and its crew, or crates of ammunition, fuel, radios, medical supplies. A single crossing rarely looked dramatic. It was just a hull cutting through black water, engine droning, men ducking instinctively when rounds cracked nearby. The drama came from the repetition. One duck after another, wave after wave, hour after hour. Behind the first line of assault boats and stormcraft that had grabbed the immediate shore, the ducks arrived and turned a fragile toehold into a living, breathing bridgehead. The 1st Infantry were reinforced not in dribs and drabs, but in truckloads. Anti-tank guns were in position before German armor could respond. Ammunition was there before the first units on the far bank had emptied their magazines. The ducks didn't win firefights. They made sure the men who did had everything they needed. For some German defenders, the memory of that night would always be tied to a particular image. Looking down at the river they had trusted to hold the enemy back and seeing it full of traffic. Not just boats, not just rafts, moving columns of strange, boxy craft that crawled across the surface in numbers no one had expected, then crawled up their own side of the bank and disappeared into the haze toward the interior. The line between road and river had blurred, and with every new wave of ducks, the uncomfortable realization grew stronger. The Rhine was no longer a serious obstacle. It was a stage the Americans were using to demonstrate how well their logistics worked. By the time dawn began to smear gray along the horizon, the German river line was no longer a line at all. Pockets still fought, some positions still fired, but the coherence was gone. Behind the thin crust of defenders, American troops and guns were already spreading out, delivered by vehicles the defenders had never accounted for in their plans. The ducks would keep running long after that first night, hauling fuel, rations, artillery shells, wounded men heading back instead of forward. But for the German defenders on the east bank, that first glimpse was the one that mattered. The moment they realized the fight for the river had been lost not just by courage or cowardice, but by a simple fact of engineering. The enemy had brought trucks that could swim, and nobody on their side had ever really believed they would. That's Section 3 of 7, the night crossing seen from both sides and the moment German defenders first confront what DUKWs actually do. In Section 4, we'll look at what happens after that first night, how the ducks turned a risky bridgehead into a supply machine, how they kept the offensive moving even when bridges lagged behind, and why German counterattacks kept slamming into Allied units that somehow never seemed to run out of men or ammunition.
By sunrise, the heroics were supposed to be over. In most river crossing stories, the drama peaks at midnight. The first wave goes over, men scramble up the far bank, a few small pockets cling on under fire. But the real test comes after that, when the first boxes of ammo run empty, the first wounded pile up, and the first German counterattack comes grinding toward the bridgehead. That's when an assault either stiffens into a solid front or runs out of everything and dies where it stands. On the Rhine, the ducks made sure it didn't die. In the gray, smoky light of early morning, the far bank was chaos. Mud churned by boots and tracks, shell holes half full of brown water, engineers hammering together makeshift ramps and positions while infantry dug in along hedgerows and ditches. Some platoons had crossed with only what they could carry: a few bandoliers of ammo, grenades clipped to belts, one or two bazookas, and not nearly enough rockets. They were tired, wired, and very aware that somewhere behind the haze of the interior, German infantry and armor were forming up for the obvious move: throw them back into the river before they could solidify. Under normal circumstances, that's exactly when a bridgehead feels weakest. But behind them, out on the water, the ducks were already making their second and third trips. To the men on the bank, it looked like a weird kind of ferry service. Ducks nosed up to whatever passed for a landing point,
an eroded cut in the bank, a rough timber ramp, the lip of a blown-out road, and GIs immediately fell on them like stevedores. Crates of rifle ammunition and machine gun belts were handed out in chains. Boxes of mortar shells thumped into shallow pits. Jerrycans of fuel were rolled, dragged, or simply dropped where someone yelled for them. Then the vehicles backed, turned, or crabbed sideways, splashed off again, and were gone, back across the river to collect another load. On the return trips they carried the wounded, lying as flat as they could on the wooden floor, empty ammo boxes and spent shell cases, engineers who'd finished their tasks and were needed somewhere else. There was no pause to reorganize in the way staff officers wrote about it. The ducks simply kept moving, smoothing out the natural spikes and crashes of a fresh landing. Instead of a fragile, starving foothold, the far bank began to behave like the edge of a normal front line. Units called for resupply and actually got it. Anti-tank guns reached forward positions before tanks arrived to challenge them. Artillery batteries on the west bank were kept fed with shell crates flowing in both directions, empty one way, full the other. The duck drivers weren't shooting, but the rhythm of their work, out, unload, back, reload, showed up indirectly in every firefight. When German troops tried to probe the new positions, they found rifles that didn't run dry and machine guns that kept talking. On the German side, the expectation was simple. Let the first wave land, pull back from the immediate shoreline if necessary, then hit them hard once they were short of ammunition and heavy weapons. It was a formula that had worked before against enemies who could move men faster than they could move support. But when German infantry edged forward or armored units rolled into range, they ran into something different. Freshly dug-in positions with mortar support right behind them. Anti-tank guns already sighted to cover likely approach routes. Reserve platoons that weren't lying on the ground gasping, they were already there because a convoy of ducks had dropped them off at dawn. From their perspective, it felt wrong. The timing was off. The enemy on the far shore didn't act like a thin crust clinging to the river. They acted like the front edge of a deep, well-supplied army, because that's exactly what they were becoming, load by load. Further back from the immediate crossing points, another problem had started to show on the German maps. All the old assumptions about traffic and timing were failing. Normally, after a major river crossing, there's a phase where everything backs up. Vehicles waiting for bridges, tanks idling in long columns, burning precious fuel, supply units stuck in jams, unable to get forward. German planners counted on those delays. Hit the bridges, hit the roads feeding them, disrupt the enemy's ability to turn a local success into a wider breakthrough. The ducks bent that logic. While engineers worked like mad to throw Bailey bridges and pontoon structures over the Rhine, the ducks were acting as temporary bridges that never stood still. If a road to one ramp got wrecked, they shifted to another. If a landing point became too exposed to artillery, they moved a little way up or down the bank. If a bridge later took a hit or traffic jammed, the ducks simply kept the flow going around it. To the German units fighting a few kilometers inland, it felt like this. No matter how hard they hit, the Allied offensive didn't seem to slow down. New infantry appeared. New gun positions opened up. Fresh tanks rolled forward, already topped off with fuel and shells. The river that should have bought them time was not buying them anything. For the Duck UV crews themselves, it was less grand and more exhausting. They measured the crossing not in historic moments, but in number of trips completed, liters of fuel burned, times they had to jump into cold water to shove a duck off a mudbank. They learned the river in a tactile way, where the current tugged hardest, where hidden sandbanks waited, which stretches always seemed to attract enemy shell fire. Between trips they snapped coffee, Fixed leaks, swapped out worn fan belts and fouled plugs. The vehicle that 1 hour had carried a platoon of infantry might the next hour be hauling crates of mortar rounds or an entire jeep lashed down in the cargo bed. Their reward wasn't medals and headlines. It was something quieter. The knowledge that, as long as they kept running their strange, awkward trucks back and forth, the men on the far bank would not be left hanging. By the time solid bridges were up and flowing a steady stream of armor and heavy vehicles, the crucial phase was already over. The bridgehead wasn't a fragile bite mark on the east bank anymore. It had grown teeth and muscle. German counterattacks that might have thrown a lightly supplied foothold back into the river instead slammed into layered positions supported by artillery that never ran out of shells, infantry that could be rotated and reinforced, fuel supplies that kept tanks and self-propelled guns moving. The Ducks didn't win those battles, but without them, many of those battles wouldn't have been fought at all, because the units supposed to hold and expand the bridgehead would have been starving for everything from bullets to bandages. For commanders looking at situation maps a few days after the crossing, the Rhine had changed meaning. What had been drawn as a black, bold boundary line was now just a squiggle behind their forward arrows. The river was no longer the last barrier. It was simply something they had crossed. The Ducks went back to being logistics tools, shifting along the river, then later to other waterways, other jobs. But in that short, critical period after the first assault waves, they did something no one on the German side had truly expected. They made sure that the Allied army on the far bank didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like it belonged there, like it had always planned to be there, like nothing as ordinary as a river was going to keep it out.
In German planning, the Rhine had always been drawn as a single, heavy line. In Allied planning, by March 1945, it was becoming something else. A series of jobs. Each job had its own code name, its own units, its own dates. A British and Canadian crossing in the north, an American crossing in the center, more crossings further south where the line was thinner. Different armies, different generals, different terrain, but one quiet constant tying them together. Wherever there was deep water and a need to get men and supplies across it fast, the Ducks appeared. In the north, where British and Canadian forces attacked near towns like Wesel and Ries, the river was wide and the banks low and marshy. Here, floating trucks weren't a surprise addition. They were built into the plan from day one. Infantry in storm boats to grab the first footholds. Amphibious tracked vehicles to carry troops and light armor. DUKWs to turn those scattered footholds into a connected front by shuttling everything from machine gun belts to field kitchens. Maps in the operations tents didn't just show arrows, they had numbers scribbled in the margins. X ducks for Wave 1, Y ducks for 75mm guns and AT guns, Z ducks reserved for medical evacuation. It looked less like a romantic river assault and more like a delivery schedule. Further south, some crossings were smaller, less famous. American divisions slipped across at places the Germans thought were unsuitable for big operations, banks too steep, currents too tricky, approaches too narrow. That was exactly where the Ducks earned their keep. A conventional crossing needed good roads to the shore and decent places to launch ferries or boats. A DUKW crossing needed a track that a truck could just barely manage, a slope you could bully 6 wheels down without flipping over, enough space for a driver to line up, take a breath, and roll into the water. What had looked like bad crossing ground on German maps sometimes turned into prime real estate for Allied planners precisely because it was unexpected and because they had vehicles that didn't need a perfect ramp to do their job.
For German troops shifting up and down the line, the pattern was unnerving. They would hear reports like, "Enemy has crossed near here. Enemy has established a bridgehead there. Enemy armor seen east of the river in this sector." Officers would protest, "But that's impossible. We destroyed the bridges. There are no ferry sites prepared. The banks there are terrible." And yet, when patrols went forward or reserve units were thrown in, they found the same reality repeated. Enemy infantry holding ground east of the river. Anti-tank guns dug in where no one expected them. Supply dumps taking shape where there should have been only thin, starving outposts. The explanation rarely mentioned the word ducks. Reports talked instead of amphibious vehicles or motorized craft. But behind those vague phrases lay the simple truth. The Allies had enough floating trucks to ignore the rule book about where and how you could support an army across a major river. In some sectors, German staff tried to adapt. They shifted artillery to shell suspected crossing points. They ordered counterattacks toward any reported bridgehead. They tried to predict where the next big effort would be by analyzing road nets and maps. The problem was the Allies were no longer limited to those obvious points. If one crossing became too costly, too exposed, or too clogged, the planners could move some ducks to a quieter stretch, push a different division across somewhere else, feed multiple bridgeheads at once instead of betting everything on one bridge or one town. From the German perspective, it began to feel like the river line was dissolving. Instead of one big, hold here at all costs fight, they were dragged into a series of overlapping crises. A new bridgehead up north, another expansion in the center, reports of American infantry fording at low water spots supported by amphibious vehicles ferrying their heavy weapons. Each alone might have been containable. All together, with floating trucks keeping them supplied, they blurred into a general collapse of the idea that the Rhine could be held as a continuous barrier. The ducks themselves remained mostly invisible in the grand narrative. They didn't appear on big situation maps with unit symbols. They weren't awarded campaign honors. But if you looked at the daily logs, you saw their fingerprints everywhere. Company X resupplied East Bank with so many tons of ammo. Ducks evacuated Y wounded to West Bank aid stations. DUKW shuttle maintained despite damage to pontoon bridge. They were the boring solution to exciting problems, and war is won or lost on boring solutions. Where German formations depended on a shrinking number of rail lines, bridges, and fuel depots, Allied forces used their river crossing gear as a way to keep their momentum even when infrastructure was smashed. A destroyed bridge was a setback. It was not a showstopper. As the weeks went on and Allied arrows moved deeper into Germany, many German soldiers stopped thinking of the Rhine as the place where it all might turn. Instead, they remembered it as the night their units were shelled off the West Bank and told to retreat, only to find the enemy already arriving on their side days later in unbelievable numbers. The time they were ordered to counterattack a bridgehead that seemed small on the map, but felt huge on the ground because it never ran out of men or ammunition. The moment they realized that even if they destroyed a bridge or choked a road with wrecks, the enemy somehow found another way to keep coming. That other way often looked like a long, boxy shape bobbing across gray water, then grinding up the bank with its cargo bed full. Not impressive, not glorious, just relentless. By the time the last organized German resistance east of the Rhine began to crumble, the river had lost its psychological power. It hadn't been a last stand. It had been a delay. And the reason it was only a delay had a lot to do with a homely machine designed by people who thought in tonnage and round trips instead of lines on maps. The ducks had done their job so well that in the larger story, they almost disappeared. But for the men who crossed that cold, fast water in the back of one, or who watched fresh supplies arriving hour after hour on the far shore, the lesson was hard to miss. In a modern war, the side that can move anything, anywhere, over anything, will eventually make every natural obstacle look small, even a river like the Rhine.
By the time the Rhine crossings happened, most Allied soldiers no longer thought of the DUKW as anything mysterious. It was just the duck. You loaded it, you rode it, you cursed it when it leaked, and loved it when it showed up out of nowhere with ammo or hot rations. But under the battered paint and mud, the duck told a much bigger story about how the Allies fought the war with engineering that started in civilian life. If you stripped DUKW down to its bones, what you found was not a secret weapon. You found a truck. At its heart, the duck was built around the same basic drivetrain as the standard GMC 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo truck that the U.S. Army used everywhere. The same engine type, the same axles, the same general layout. The designers hadn't started by saying, let's create a revolutionary amphibious wonder. They had started by asking a simpler question. What if we take a truck that already works and give it a hull? So they took the proven 6x6 chassis, wrapped it in a boat-shaped steel shell, added a propeller, rudder, and bilge pumps, modified the suspension and steering so it could handle both roads and water. The result looked odd, but every odd bit had a reason. The high sides, to keep waves out and give space for cargo. The sloping bow, to let it push through water and slide up muddy banks. The winch at the front, to haul itself or others out of trouble. It was a collection of simple ideas wired together in a way that made sense to people who thought in terms of deliveries, not duels. For mechanics, the DUKW's greatest strength was almost boring. They already knew how to work on most of it. If you'd been fixing GMC trucks in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy, and someone parked a duck in front of your tools, you didn't see an alien creature. You saw a familiar engine block, recognizable gearbox and transfer case, standard electrics and fittings. Yes, there were extra headaches, seals, hull leaks, the propeller drive, the steering linkages to the rudder. But the core of the machine spoke the same language as the rest of the Allied motor pool. That meant spare parts were easier to find. A gearbox component meant for a regular truck could often be used on a duck. Workshops didn't need special, rare tools. Ordinary wrenches and pullers did most of the job. Training time was short. A mechanic who could keep a 2.5-ton truck going could be brought up to duck standard far faster than if this had been some exotic one-off amphibious contraption. The duck was weird to look at. It was extremely normal to maintain. And in a war where weird usually meant good luck finding spares, that normality was golden. Then there was the party trick that soldiers loved and engineers quietly admired. The duck could adjust its own tire pressure on the move. On land, especially on hard roads, you wanted firm tires to carry heavy loads at speed. But try to drive a heavy vehicle across sand, mud, or a soft riverbank with fully inflated tires, and you'd quickly bog down to the axles. The DUKW had a built-in system that let the driver bleed air from the tires or pump them back up while still rolling. Heading toward a soft beach or muddy slope? Drop the pressure, let the tires spread, and float over the surface. Back on firm ground? Bring the pressure back up. Get your road speed and fuel efficiency again. It was a small detail, invisible in most photos.
but it meant that a duck could go places where a normal truck would sink and then keep going without needing an airline or workshop stop. That kind of detail came from a design team thinking not just about can it float, but can it keep doing this every day? From a driver's perspective, the duck was a compromise, but a very workable one. On the road, it was slower and more top-heavy than a regular truck. A bit noisy, a bit drafty, with a haul that amplified every rattle. In the water, it was no speedboat, more of a plodding barge. Sensitive to currents and wind. Something you never stopped respecting because the river didn't forgive stupidity. But critically, the controls made sense. You still had a steering wheel. You still shifted gears like in a truck. The extra levers and switches, propeller, bilge pump, tire pressure controls, could be taught and drilled. Drivers trained on ducks learned patterns. Before water, check bilge pumps, hatches, drain plugs, tire pressures. Entering water, correct angle, controlled speed, smooth transition off the bank. On water, maintain spacing, watch landmarks, trust your compass and guide lights. Exiting water, pick your spot, commit to the climb, don't baby it halfway and bog yourself down. It wasn't easy, but it was systematic. You didn't need genius, just discipline and repetition. When you line that up next to the German experience with many of their specialized vehicles, the contrast is sharp. German designs often demanded highly trained specialist drivers, mechanics familiar with one particular model's quirks, careful, almost delicate operation to avoid catastrophic failures. The duck asked for something else. Ordinary men willing to work hard, mechanics with general truck experience, a logistics system that could feed it fuel and parts. In exchange, it gave commanders a tool they could count on, a vehicle that could collect a load in a supply dump inland, drive to the river under its own power, cross and land without cranes, docks, or specialized harbor gear, turn around and do it again until the crew dropped from exhaustion or someone ordered them to stop. What made all of this possible wasn't one clever idea. It was the same thing that had made the Sherman so reliable. Industrial maturity. The duck existed because America had companies that knew how to mass-produce trucks. Shipbuilders and naval architects knew how to draw hulls that handled waves. The military had enough spare capacity and money to say, we need a truck that floats, go figure it out. When the prototypes worked, the factories did the rest. Not a handful, not 100, thousands. Enough that you could assign DUKW companies to major operations as standard, not as some rare one-off special feature. Enough that losing some to mines, artillery, or accidents didn't cripple the plan. That's why, by the time of the Rhine crossings, the duck had stopped being exotic and started being invisible in the best way. It was assumed. It was written into schedules and tonnage calculations. It was part of how the Allied Army moved, same as roads and railways. To the Germans, who prided themselves on precision engineering, the duck could look crude, even ugly. It didn't have armor plate, heavy guns, complex turrets or optics. But that was the point. All the complexity in German wonder weapons, electric transmissions, high-velocity guns, finely machined components, came with a hidden price tag in reliability and maintainability. All the simplicity in the duck, standard truck guts, a basic steel hull, a few smart add-ons, came with its own payoff. It worked often enough and in enough numbers that it changed what rivers meant on the map. When commanders know that a river does not automatically cut their logistics chain, they plan differently. They become bolder. They can accept risks, knowing they won't leave their men stranded on the far side with empty magazines and empty stomachs. The duck wasn't a symbol of power. It was a tool of confidence. In the end, that's what tied the DUKW back to the broader story. The Sherman was a tank built by an automotive culture. The Duck was an amphibious truck built by the same culture. Both were expressions of a mindset that said, if you can mass-produce something simple, robust, and easy to fix, you can do more with it than with a handful of delicate masterpieces. For the men in the Ducks, that philosophy translated into long, wet nights, aching backs, and chapped hands. For the German soldiers who saw them grinding up the far bank of the Rhine and disappearing inland with yet another load of troops and supplies, it translated into a cold realization. They weren't just losing to tanks and planes. They were losing to vehicles that did exactly what they were supposed to do over and over without drama.
By the time the last Allied units finished crossing the Rhine, almost nobody on the front lines thought of it as the Great Barrier anymore. For the German High Command, the Rhine had always been more than a river on a map. It was a symbol. The border of the old Reich, a natural fortress running from the mountains to the sea, a place where, in theory, depleted divisions could finally make a stand. But rivers don't care about symbols. They care about physics and engineering. And in 1945, the side that understood that better was not the one relying on the river as a magic line, but the one that had filled its rear areas with things like ugly amphibious trucks. Talk to a German soldier who was there in those last months, and his memories of the Rhine often come out as fragments. Nights under bombardment on the West Bank, then orders to pull back and destroy bridges. A retreat across crowded pontoon spans as smoke and flames wrapped the towns behind him. Rumors, the bridges are down, they can't follow us quickly, we'll have time to reorganize. Then, days or even hours later, reports that the enemy had already crossed somewhere else. Strange boats that looked like trucks with high sides, carrying men and guns straight over the water. Frustration when counterattacks met not a thin, gasping foothold, but a solid block of positions backed by apparently endless supplies. For him, the river hadn't betrayed anything. It had simply failed to do what people had wished it would do. On the Allied side, the memory of the Rhine crossings is just as fragmented, but in a different way. An infantryman might remember sitting low in a duck's hole, boots damp, rifle clutched across his chest, listening to the sound of water slapping against steel and trying not to think about how cold it would be if they went under. Jumping out on the far bank into mud and confusion, pushing forward to clear a hedgerow or a farmhouse, while someone yelled about arcs of fire and someone else yelled about where the next resupply would land. A duck driver might remember counting trips instead of hours, fighting the current on one crossing and the wind on the next, the way the river seemed to change personality at night versus dawn, but the cargo always stayed the same. Men, ammo, fuel, wounded. A mechanic might remember swapping out a fan belt with numb fingers, patching a hull seam with whatever was at hand and hoping it held until the end of the operation. None of them were thinking, "We are redefining the meaning of a strategic river." They were thinking, "Don't stall, don't get hit, don't let these guys down." But when you string all those small, tired decisions together, you get something bigger. A crossing that works not just as a daring assault, but as the opening move in a continuous advance. In traditional military thinking, obstacles like rivers were supposed to divide campaigns into phases. Phase 1, reach the river. Phase 2, pause, build bridges, bring up supplies. Phase 3, cross, form a bridgehead. Phase 4,
rebuild your logistics, then resume the offensive. The Rhine crossings of 1945 began to blur those neat lines. The ducks were one reason why. Because if you can move infantry in truck-sized loads over the water, follow right behind with anti-tank guns and heavy weapons, keep a steady stream of ammunition and fuel arriving from the first night onward, then the pause phase shrinks. The bridgehead matures faster than the enemy expects, and the moment of maximum vulnerability, the thin strip of land on the far bank, doesn't stay thin for very long. For German counterattack plans built on the idea that we will hit them hard before they can bring their logistics across, that change was lethal. By the time many counterattacks were ready, they weren't hitting a fragile lodgment. They were hitting a well-fed, well-supplied, and already expanding front. Seen from far above, on the map scale of generals and historians, the Rhine crossings marked the point where the last real hope of stopping the Western Allies evaporated. But seen from closer in, at the level of tracks in mud and tire prints in wet sand, the story is even simpler. The Allies had figured out how to make movement more reliable than resistance. Rivers, roads wrecked by bombs, bridges blown by retreating troops, all of these were supposed to slow an army down to the point where smaller defending forces could stand a chance. Yet when an army has mass-produced tanks that actually reach the battlefield, trucks and amphibious vehicles that share common parts and familiar engines, drivers and mechanics trained on the same systems across an entire theater, then the natural and man-made obstacles lose some of their teeth. The Shermans showed that in tank combat. The Ducks showed it on the rivers. Together they told the same story in two different environments. If your opponent builds machines to keep working, and you build machines to look impressive on paper, the river is not going to save you. After the war, it would be easy to forget the Ducks. There are no famous movies about them storming beaches under heroic music. They didn't feature in glamorous kill counts or ace stories. But military planners noticed. They saw how the ability to cross water quickly and in bulk changed what could be attempted. Logistics vehicles, fuel trucks, ammo carriers, ambulances had as much impact on victory as any single weapon system. Designing transport around reliability and interchangeability let you do things like multiple simultaneous river crossings that a more fragile, elite system simply could not sustain. You can see those lessons echoed later in how armies think about bridging, amphibious gear, and supply chains. The idea that we need a platform that can move stuff anywhere, not just specialized units that do one thing beautifully, traces back in part to anonymous workhorses like the Duck. For the Germans who fought on the Rhine, the lesson was harsher and more immediate. Many of them had grown up hearing about the river as a proud boundary, a guarantee that foreign armies would not easily march into the heartland again. In 1945, they saw something else. Foreign armor east of the water within days. Supply convoys coming and going as if the river was just a wide, wet road. Their own units starved of fuel and ammunition, while the enemy's columns seemed to be permanently resupplied. It wasn't just defeat. It was the realization that the assumptions behind how they had expected the war to be fought were wrong. They had believed that bravery, good positions, and a big river could compensate for shortages in industry and logistics. The Ducks, grinding back and forth with faceless persistence, were the physical proof that this belief no longer fit the world they were living in. So when we say German defenders never knew the Americans had Ducks, we're not just talking about a gap in intelligence reports. We're talking about a deeper gap. One side still thinking in terms of lines you can hold and bridges you can blow. The other side thinking in terms of flows, tons per hour, trips per night, vehicles that can switch from road to river and back without asking permission from the terrain. The first side saw the Rhine and hoped it would slow the war down. The second side saw the Rhine and asked, "What do we need to drive across it?" The answer, in part, was an ungainly six-wheeled truck with a hull around it. Not a miracle, not a secret wonder weapon, just a clever, reliable tool multiplied thousands of times and used exactly as intended. In the end, the story of the ducks on the Rhine isn't really about a single vehicle type. It's about what happens when a country's factories, engineers, and logistics officers all pull in the same direction and build for practical success instead of prestige. The Rhine did not stop being impressive. It stopped being decisive. And that change is what turned March 1945 from the last line of German defense into the month when the Western Front finally broke open for good. Somewhere in that transformation, rumbling across gray water with a load of tired soldiers or stacked ammunition crates, a duck was doing exactly what it was made to do. Not to be glorious, just to make sure that, on the far bank, the war kept moving.